Hello world. Uh, this is the Green podcast. We're having a lot of new podcasts. I already forgot the name. I always tend to mix this shit up. So this is Axel et al. Eco-Socialism from behind the Iron Curtain. Yeah, why are we talking about this? And who is Axel?
Well, Axel is somebody who lives at the moment in upstate New York. He just noticed his phone is on, so he has to turn it off because it keeps ringing. Upstate New York, near the Canadian border. That's probably one of the reasons why I'm wearing my jacket right now, because it's pretty cold in my office. I teach European history, in particular German history, at the State University of New York in Potsdam, a small town in upstate New York. And I want to talk about eco-socialism in East Germany because it's a very interesting current of dissident Marxists in former East Germany. And it's a current of Marxist thought that is more relevant than ever, because we live in a day and age when, notwithstanding how cold it is right now, climate change and a heating planet are upon us. And it's obvious that our current economic system has a great deal to do with why our climate is falling apart. And if we want to build a more sustainable world, we have to figure out why this world is not sustainable. And eco-socialist ideas, I think, are very useful in explaining why our current economic system is absolutely inadequate in organizing a society and an economic system that is sustainable in not just the long run, but even in the medium and the short run. So eco-socialism, eco-Marxism, those are very interesting and highly relevant ideas. And I think it's worthwhile talking about them, and not just focusing on these ideas in the United States and in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, such as the former Soviet bloc, and of course the entire globe, because the entire globe is deeply impacted by what's happening to our entire global ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's extremely well put. Also, where I'm coming from with this, bit too, as usual, much of a nerd and into the topics. So I'm pretty aware that in about 50 years, this city wouldn't exist anymore if we keep on doing what the fuck we're doing. Because sitting here on the northern plains in Germany is where we were supposed to lose our tank warfare against the Soviets. But World War III didn't really get hot, just left the stage cold or some shit, pathetic bullshit. So we have to go under. And the water's coming. Water levels will be rising about, what was it, 300 meters? When all of the ice is melting, because most of the people are not even aware that we are still in a fucking ice age. Because there's still ice on the poles. Yeah, that's how this works. And then also with all the temperature and bullshit, the oceans, the water is expanding. So we don't even, but we know. That's a silly thing. We have our geology, we have our ice core probes, we know where the water level stood the last fucking time Earth had no ice. So bye-bye, people. This is just for the future, for the poor idiots sitting in the caves in the Alps or whatnot. Socialism. What is socialism to do with all this? I've seen a lot of bullshit, man. With Marxists pretending we can keep on capitalist production with planned obsolescence and all that bullshit waved into the system as if there wouldn't be some toxic disaster at the end of all that. And they're still busy selling us this is a happy end. So this is also where my anger comes in. And yeah, I think that's that for an introduction. So take it from here.
Yes, absolutely. Anger is more than justified. And anger is, I think, perhaps in many ways more useful than just pessimism and despair, even though I understand pessimism and despair as well, because, the situation does not look very good in terms of what we see already in front of our eyes. I mean, the signs are very obvious in terms of ecological degradation. So-called planetary boundaries have been crossed in terms of natural cycles. While the science of it is obviously complex, I think the basic principles are fairly straightforward and everyone can understand them. If you keep putting toxins into the soil, if you keep putting toxins into the water, if you keep putting toxins into the atmosphere, eventually critical thresholds will be reached, and the natural systems, which can compensate remarkably well for a long time, will not be able to compensate any longer. And things will reach tipping points and systems will collapse, they will readjust. This does not mean, of course, that, climate change has never happened before. In fact, there used to be many time periods in Earth history where there was quite a bit of climate change, but we have had about 11,000, 12,000 years of relative climate stability, and it looks like that time period is now coming to an end. It probably would have lasted a little longer, but because of human activity, it is ending prematurely, and human activity does not mean every human on Earth is equally responsible for what is happening to our planet. There's a particular economic system that should be blamed for it. I'm sure many of our listeners have heard the term Anthropocene. The new geological age where human activity is the primary driver of climate change. But there have been some climate scientists and some environmental sociologists who have proposed an alternative title, Capitalism. And Elmar Altvater, for example, a Marxist sociologist and ecologist, was one of the people who championed this title, Capitalism, because it doesn't just highlight the role of humans in this climate change, but the role of a particular socioeconomic system, capitalism, which has at its very core, capital accumulation and profit maximization, as opposed to producing for human use, as in improving the lives of all humans. We're talking about a system that is geared toward fulfilling the needs for accumulation of resources for a very small minority. Mm-hmm. And this sort of connects with what we have been talking about in the past a great deal, different definitions of socialism, and the way Erich Fromm has defined socialism as something that must put human beings at the very center, that must be focused on, fulfilling the real needs of human beings, as opposed to looking at human beings as sort of an appendix to the economy. Fromm argued the economy must exist for humans as opposed to humans existing for the economy. And that brings us to issues such as, economic growth. What is the purpose of economic growth? Does economic growth serve as an end in and of itself? Or is economic growth something that is justified if it is sustainable and if it benefits all of humanity and does not endanger the entire ecosystem? So there have been rival definitions of what socialism means. Erich Fromm argued socialism must mean developing the economic system in a way that benefits all human beings equally in a sustainable fashion. And that definition was not really the definition that was, shared within the Soviet system. It was shared on a rhetorical level superficially, but within the Soviet system, there was a lot of emphasis on economic growth as an end in and of itself, justified in terms of developing the forces of production. The forces of production as what would, usher in not just the socialist age, but the eventually communist stage of human development. And there have been some Marxists on the other side of the Iron Curtain who very much took issue with this definition of socialism. They followed a more Frommian take. And among those Marxists were eco-socialists as well. And I want to talk about three eco-socialists, East German eco-socialists in particular, Wolfgang Harich, Robert Havemann, and Rudolf Bahro. But in order to sort of contextualize them, I need to say something about critical Marxists in East Germany in general. And I think it makes sense when we deal with critical Marxists in East Germany to sort of put them in a framework of four different types of critical Marxists. And I need to explain what I mean with critical Marxists. With critical Marxists, I essentially mean those people who use Marxism as a methodology that is seen largely as sort of the theory and practice of the self-emancipation of the working class, of working people. And this definition contrasts with the ideology that developed within the Soviet-controlled realm. That ideology is referred to, and it called itself Marxism-Leninism. And the interesting thing about Marxism-Leninism is that one could argue that Marxism-Leninism was actually not really Marxism, and it was not really Leninism, but it actually was a form of Stalinism. It's essentially an ideology developed by a political party or by the bureaucracy that controlled a political party, the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. It was developed in the mid to late 1920s, and it sort of became the legitimizing ideology of the party bureaucracy. It called itself Marxism-Leninism, even though it was developed after the death of Marx. Marx died in 1883, and it was also developed after the death of Lenin, who died in 1924. So in some ways, what Marxism-Leninism as an official state ideology became is sort of comparable to Christianity. Christianity is named after Jesus, or there's a reference, obviously, to Jesus, but it developed long after, or at least decades after Jesus was, the historical Jesus was killed, so or died, or executed, of course. So the same thing happens in terms of Marxism, Leninism. So Marxism, Leninism, the official state ideology in East Germany, has to be differentiated from critical Marxism, which is an approach that is preferred by those who actually try to use Marxist ideas not to legitimize their own power, but to ask themselves, how can these ideas be used to, first of all, understand our world today? And secondly, how can they be used in order to help working people fight for a better world?
So
Okay, so
interesting
that is
that
what I
you
mean with critical Marxism. It's distinct from the official state ideologies that sometimes are called or call themselves Marxism, Leninism.
yeah, interesting that you mentioned power and immediately presented it this way, because that seems to be an underlying issue with our culture, or liberalism as the root cause or root issue in this case. And you always get in those institutions we have, parties or whatever, you get a fraction, and that's drifting to the right, and then ruling itself into the bureaucracy, and then with the bureaucracy taking the rest of the party with them. And then is just a grift at some point. Even if it's not a grift personally, it's a grift for the administration, for the bureaucracy. And things have to be this way so they can work. And there is no other way. There is no alternative. Whatever. I mean, there's some kind of I forgot the word again, but gravitation, and motion. And when it starts to spinning, you know, the motion stays there. It's a lot of mass.
Absolutely, yes.
That
So
came to mind.
bureaucratization unfolds a dynamic of its own where whatever people's personal and individual intentions and subjective intentions are, they're pushed into certain patterns. So then, yes, and again, some of it definitely is a matter of intentions, and some of them are quite sinister intentions, but some of them are, issues of, as you pointed out, the gravity of institutions, right? Where whatever your personal intentions are, you're pushed into certain patterns of behavior because of
exactly
what these institutions compel you to do.
Mm-hmm. And you already brought up another indicator of sort, gross domestic product, GDP, and how that has reverted to mythology, to idols, to idolizations, to a kind of delusional outlook on economic growth, when this also seems to lay bare another cultural problem that is in this conflict you mentioned within the Eastern Bloc, and then with more Frommian and more, you could say, Marxist philosophers getting into trouble with the iron boots of the system, because there has to be efficiency, there has to be economic growth to keep the Marxist state running, because they run on taxes and they have to spend military to be safe. And so there's this fear of freedom baked into the entire shit. So, which is why I was happy you mentioned Fromm, because that already lays down the path we already paved and brings it
Absolutely.
good together.
Absolutely. Not all of that in the Eastern Bloc obviously was decided by the Eastern Bloc. For example, there is the issue of the Cold War, right? And while there were forces within the Eastern Bloc that were militaristic on their own. Case in point, East Germany, right? East Germany did not exist in a vacuum. The East Germans didn't suddenly come into existence in 1949 when East Germany was created. East Germany existed on the territory partially of the old Prussian state. So the mentalities of Prussia continue to exist in East Germany as well, right? So just as, Prussian militarism existed in West Germany. It also existed in East Germany, and the East German state carried consciously and unconsciously these traditions. But East Germany also developed somewhat of a police state mentality because it was truly threatened by the West. It was at the frontier of the Cold War, and it did have to defend itself. So what I'm trying to say is, one cannot disregard the larger geopolitical circumstances.
Why?
Either,
Everyone
right?
has to do this to survive
Yeah,
in this media economy. Come on,
yeah,
stop
yeah.
fucking with the company. Get in line.
Yes, exactly. So, but coming back to the issue of liberalism, I spoke with my students about liberalism just yesterday, and I said to them, one problem with liberalism is that so many liberals don't take their own liberalism seriously, right? And that is a universal problem, right?
We have to
There's lip
liberate.
service to certain ideological suppositions, yet there is such a gap between rhetoric and reality, right?
Liberate the liberals.
Exactly. Liberate the liberals.
We need to
Exactly.
print that on shirts.
Exactly. So, coming back to the issue of dissent, Marxist dissent within East Germany. So, we're talking about a group of people who are fundamentally in support of the ideals of the East German state. They believe that capitalism is unsustainable and there has to be a socialist society. Socialism is the necessary alternative to capitalism. So they're not dissidents because they oppose the socialist project. They're dissidents because they believe East Germany is not properly implementing the socialist project. So they agree with the East German overall objective of building a socialist society. They don't want to get rid of East Germany. They don't want German unification under, West German leadership. They want a better East Germany. They want a better and truly, as they see it, socialist East German society. In fact, they would like a socialist West Germany as well. They would like to see a socialist world. They also like several other things about East Germany. They are supportive of East Germany as an anti-fascist state. It's very difficult for us today to really appreciate that. But West Germany was, even in legal terms, the successor state to Nazi Germany, right? It defended, in legal terms, the boundaries, the borders of 1937. So East Germany defined itself as an anti-fascist state, and that had a lot of credibility even to people who were critical of what they saw as the Stalinist perversion of the socialist project in East Germany. So essentially, when it comes to critical Marxists, Marxists who wanted a socialist project on German soil, there were 4 different versions. And I want to briefly develop this typology a little bit. There is, first of all, the category of those who eventually left, because while they tried to make a home in East Germany, ultimately they concluded conditions were impossible for anyone to be a real Marxist in East German society. So there were those Marxist, critical Marxist dissidents who attempted to be critical Marxists in East Germany, but at some point they concluded it's impossible. You either will be broken by the system or you have to leave. So that's the first category. The second category is the category of those who stayed, but they decided they can only write for the future. They wrote essentially for their desks and for the drawers in their desks. They decided, yes, they will stay, but they will never be able to publish the books they want to publish. So they said, okay, whatever manuscripts we're finishing, they will be published probably years, if not decades, after our death. And many of those actually ended quite tragically as well. And I will mention one example, the economist Fritz Behrens, who ended up taking his own life. He was an East German economist. He proposed ideas that try to make the East German economy more efficient. He also tried to make it more democratic, and his recommendations were ignored by high-ranking party officials, and whatever book manuscripts he produced could not be published in East Germany. He, of course, could try to smuggle them into the West, but he concluded that would just, in his mind, strengthen the other side. He did not want to strengthen the capitalist side, so he decided to write his manuscripts and wait for conditions to change, and they would probably not change in a long time. And that made him very, very depressed, and eventually this depression became a clinical depression, and he took his own life. Then there's the case of the so-called tightrope walkers. The tightrope walkers are those people who try to do the impossible, to be critical Marxists and to publish critical books, while at the same time avoiding being thrown into jail in East Germany, and also avoid being forced to leave for the West. Doing that was essentially impossible, but there were still a few people who were able to pull it off, and I will mention some in just a few seconds. And then there's the example of the open dissidents, those who decided to confront the East German party state, and they paid a very high price. They went usually either to prison, or they were put under house arrest and heavy-duty surveillance. And the 3 East German eco-socialists I want to talk about, Wolfgang Harich, Robert Havemann, and Rudolf Bahro, they were all part of that category. The open dissidents who were either put into jail, like Wolfgang Harich and Rudolf Bahro, or put under house arrest, like Robert Havemann. So let me go back to the first category, those who left. And I'm just curious, do you know any East German critical Marxists who, after a decade or so, maybe earlier, eventually said, East Germany is not hospitable to any kind of critical Marxism. We have to get out of this country, or it will
Actually, a
break
few,
us.
but I'm really bad with names. That's my problem, like personally. You can
Oh,
introduce yourself like you did, like, hi, I'm Axel. I'll be like, hey, Alex, how's it going? My brain is just not made for this kind of stuff. It's kind of redundant information. I'm eating up all the rest, you know. But names is kind of, it's weird. It's just
the same thing happens to me quite often when it comes to beer, and I mix up names all the time as well, right? When it
but
comes to, I should not say that probably, but when it comes to students, sometimes, especially when I get new students every semester, it takes me quite a while to remember and connect faces with names and so on and so forth, especially as I get older, right?
mm,
So, I mean, memory does not improve.
yeah,
Wine
it's
improves
that.
with age, but
And
not memory.
no, it's also no. I don't really think it's that. My mind be wandering, and I can really memorize stuff. I'm just amazed later. What kind of bullshit can you memorize? Like, kind of totally weird, random bits. But yeah, I can pull it off, but not names or numbers or phone numbers. I was pretty good with that back then as a kid, but now. No, I would
Yeah.
have looked. I don't even know my own postal code. I mean,
Oh
really,
God,
it's
yes.
just, it's just.
Yeah. Well, I
What is it
remember.
again? Ah, that one. Yeah, yeah, looks
Yeah,
familiar. Okay.
I remember Slavoj Žižek once. He had some camera team come to his apartment, and they asked him, "So what apartment number are you at?" And he didn't know, so he had to go to the door to look it up. So, well, okay. So, those who left, one of the most famous, perhaps the most famous, would be Ernst Bloch, the philosopher Ernst Bloch, who wrote this famous 3-volume book on the principle of hope. So he lived in the United States during the Nazi years, and after World War II and the defeat of Nazism, he returned to Europe and he settled in East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, and he was offered the position, a fairly prestigious position, as professor of philosophy at the University of Leipzig. And that meant a great deal to him because Marxists were excluded from university positions in Germany for forever. So being able to get this professorship in Leipzig, a fairly well-established university in Germany, long before East Germany was founded, meant a great deal. It meant financial security. The Blochs had to always, struggle for survival in the U.S. Now he had this good, well-paying job. He had a big house. He had a car and a chauffeur. So life was good for him. And as time went on, things became increasingly difficult because the establishment of Marxist Leninist philosophy meant not just for Marxist philosophers to be able to get jobs, but for Marxist philosophy to become pushed into a very dogmatic framework, where ultimately the party and the party line became paramount. So Ernst Bloch felt increasingly pressured, and he experienced censorship. He ran into more and more difficulties, was pushed into making compromises. So at some point in the early 1960s, he decided not to return from a conference in West Germany. So he ended up getting a professorship in Tübingen in the West, and he stayed. And in fact, one of his assistants, Jürgen Teller, was punished. They couldn't punish him any longer because he stayed in the West, but Jürgen Teller, his assistant, was dismissed from the university, and they called it Bewährung in der Produktion. You had to prove yourself in manual labor. He was forced to work in a factory. Now, there's nothing wrong with manual labor, and it, interestingly enough, was seen as punishment in a state officially defined as a workers' and peasant state, or workers' and farmers' state. But it illustrates there was a considerable amount of hypocrisy involved in these things as well. Bloch was not the only one who left when things became intolerable. At the University of Leipzig, there was a very interesting and critical Marxist named Hans Meyer, professor of German literature. He also left and became a professor ultimately in Hanover in West Germany because he concluded conditions were too intolerable. And there were people who left earlier, already in the late 1940s. Leo Koffler, who had a professorship of philosophy at the University of Halle, he decided conditions are impossible for any kind of critical Marxist philosophy that does not accept reclamation and control on part of the party. So some critical Marxists in East Germany decided the only way to really maintain their independence is by leaving. That was one route. The other route I already outlined briefly, writing for the future, hoping that conditions will get better, but that would be a long shot. And part of choosing that route means accepting that you will probably have to accept you will not get your books, the books you wanted to be published. You will not get those books published, and you will not have much influence during your lifetime. The third option was to become the impossible tightrope walker. And in order to explain what that means, I have to look at an example. Jürgen Kuczynski, the economic historian Jürgen Kuczynski. Now, did your laugh illustrate some sort of recognition? Does the name Jürgen Kuczynski
let's
mean
go with
anything
no.
to you?
Let's go with no. Just go on.
Good. So Jürgen Kuczynski was East Germany's most officially critical Marxist. He published a book called, well, he published many books. He published over 150 books in his lifetime. So he was very productive. But there was one book, Dialog mit meinem Urenkel. It's difficult to translate into English. Dialogue with my great-grandson. It's a very opaque title in English, Dialog mit meinem Urenkel. And the East German Politburo member Konrad Naumann called it das republikfeindlichste Buch, the most anti-East German book ever published in East Germany. It is a book composed of fictitious questions by Jürgen Kuczynski's great-grandson. He himself made up these questions, where he asks himself critical questions such as, Grandpa, how did you survive the Stalin time? And why are you still a communist today, even though you know about what Stalin has done? Jürgen Kuczynski joined the German Communist Party in 1930. So the book is essentially a series of fairly critical questions about life in East Germany. One question was, do you think Lenin would be happy with our socialism today? If Lenin were still alive today, would he like life in East Germany? And Kuczynski's answer was, no, he would be deeply disappointed. Now, this is not the kind of answer the party leadership liked. So the book manuscript was completed in 1977, but the book did not come out until 1984. And it only came out because ultimately Erich Honecker's daughter, Sonja Honecker, Erich Honecker was the party leader in East Germany at that time, in office for 18 years. She liked the book, she read the manuscript, and she recommended it to her father. And she said, you know, this book actually makes the case for East Germany. Jürgen Kuczynski is one of the most loyal party members. He wants East Germany to succeed. And this book is meant to convince people who are critical of East Germany to support our state. So Kuczynski's argument was Lenin would be disappointed because he would have hoped we would be much further along. And we should be much further along, but that should be reason for us to try even harder, because the DDR is worth supporting. Kuczynski was a speechwriter for Erich Honecker, and he always praised himself. He said, you know, I have as many party medals as I have party punishments. Ich habe so viele Parteistrafen, wie ich Parteiauszeichnungen habe. So he saw himself as a loyal dissident. And he was the director of the Institute for Economic History. He supported East Germany. He wrote speeches for Erich Honecker. And then he praised these speeches in the party newspaper. He said, look, our comrade Honecker gave very insightful comments on the world economic situation. He wrote very interesting things about the capitalist economic system and its development. The interesting thing was Kuczynski wrote those things for Honecker. At the same time, Kuczynski was very critical about the inefficiency of the East German economy, its many problems with authoritarianism and so on and so forth. So Kuczynski did both. He supported the system and he criticized the system. Sometimes some of his books did not get published, or they got published many years later. He was someone who negotiated. He was on personally friendly terms with Honecker, and at the same time, he was able to help many people. Again, he saw himself as a critical voice, as a loyal dissident, so to say. But there were only a few people who were able to do this. Not everyone was able, when they run into difficulties, to, make an appointment with Honecker himself and or get his book manuscript to Honecker's daughter, and thus, get things arranged differently. Another example of a tightrope walker would be Bertolt Brecht, the famous playwright Bertolt Brecht, who committed himself to living in East Germany. But he always made sure he would never give up his Austrian citizenship. So if things got really difficult, he could always leave if necessary. But he decided that he would not have to, because, the East German leadership knew he could leave if he wanted to. But that would also mean East Germany would lose a very prestigious person, Bertolt Brecht, and that would be a public relations defeat for East Germany.
Disaster.
Finally, we have the open dissidents. But being an open dissident meant risking a prison sentence. And that is what ultimately happens or happened to the Eco-Socialists, to Wolfgang Harich and to Rudolf Bahro, and it almost happened to Robert Havemann. But, they didn't imprison him because Robert Havemann was already imprisoned by the Nazis. The Nazis imprisoned him for about a decade, and they sentenced him to death. And the East German state couldn't easily imprison Robert Havemann again, because East Germany defined itself as the anti-fascist state. And thus putting into prison someone who was already imprisoned by the Nazis, and not only imprisoned by the Nazis, but sentenced to death, would have been problematic for East Germany. It would have damaged the anti-fascist reputation.
Whoopsie.
Right? The Spiegel would have written, this West German big circulation political magazine would have written, the Nazis put him into a prison, and now the Stalinists imprisoned him as well. And East Germany did not want that headline.
No.
So they would have liked him to leave, but Robert Havemann refused to leave. He said, I'm going to stay in East Germany. And I know that's what you hate more than anything else, so that's why I'm doing it. So they did the next best thing. They put him under house arrest. Okay. So,
very good.
Do you want me to tell you why Harich and Havemann and Bahro ended up either in prison or under house arrest?
We are short on time today, but I want to hear all of it. Just go for it. It goes down
Good.
from your time.
Okay, so then let me start with Wolfgang Harich. He was a problem for East Germany even before he became an eco-socialist. Because, to tell you a little bit about him and his background, he came from an educated bourgeois family, a middle-class family. He belonged to the Bildungsbürgertum, which is a term that is very difficult to translate into English. The approximate equivalent would be to call him, or his social category, the bourgeoisie of education. His father was an intellectual and a writer. His mother came from a similar background. He studied philosophy when he was still a teenager. He was interested in the philosopher Nikolaus Hartmann. He was interested in our friend Hegel. I think we have had many conversations about Hegel on this platform. And he actually got into difficulties with the East German state when he unwittingly and inadvertently challenged Stalin's interpretation of Hegel. I don't remember the specifics, but he criticized the interpretation of Hegel that was Stalin's without realizing it was Stalin's. And it made the authorities suspicious. At that point, Wolfgang Harich was already a professor, a very young man and professor at Humboldt University in East Berlin. So right after World War II, Soviet officials, including Wolfgang Leonhard, who was the son of a German communist who fled to the Soviet Union, they were sent into East Germany to look for cadre, for young, promising people who were willing to work with the Soviet authorities. So Wolfgang Leonhard befriended this young man who was very intelligent, Wolfgang Harich, and interested in Marxist ideas, and tried to recruit him for some political position. And Harich was flattered, but he said, I'm more interested in some academic job and maybe some cultural position. So Leonhard said, all right, absolutely. I tell Walter Ulbricht to send me, the leader of the German communists who were sent back from Moscow. Yes, you're a promising guy. We are definitely interested in working with you. So eventually, Wolfgang Harich joins the German Communist Party, the KPD. And in 1946, when the KPD and the Social Democrats unify into the SED, the Socialist Unity Party, Harich joins that party as well. And he will very quickly be promoted to a professor of philosophy at the university in East Berlin, Humboldt University in East Berlin. Very quickly, because the newly established regime East Germany is created in 1949, it needs Marxist philosophy professors. And there are not too many. There are, of course, lots of loyal communists, but very few of them have doctorates in philosophy. So Harich fits the ticket. He is loyal to this new system, and he also is highly qualified. So he gets a lot of support from the Ulbricht government. He becomes not just a philosophy professor when he's still in his 20s. He also is the founder of the German Journal of Philosophy, the Deutsche Zeitschrift für Philosophie. Harich is incredibly energetic, incredibly bright, incredibly resourceful, and early on he also plays a leading role in one of East Germany's newly established publishing houses, the Aufbau Verlag. So he has his fingers in many pies, and his career takes off very quickly. Fast forward to 1956. De-Stalinization takes place in the Soviet Union. Stalin dies already in 1953. 1956, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev gives his famous speech in Moscow at the 20th Party Congress, where he essentially reveals some of the crimes committed by Stalin. This is a shock for many communists around the world, and it gives them some degree of encouragement and license to be more critical as well. So Wolfgang Harich is encouraged by this process of de-Stalinization, the so-called thaw, to advocate for a German path to socialism. So what he essentially concludes is Ulbricht, the leader of East Germany, is a mini Stalin, and it is time to advocate for something better. And he calls this a German path to socialism, not following the Soviet model any longer, but trying something more independent. There have been debates about whether what Wolfgang Harich wanted really amounts to a break with Stalinism. Some have called it an attempt of a revolution from above. I would say definitely would have been a far less authoritarian form of socialism. At the same time, Harich was a very eccentric person. He had his own ideas about things, and he often did not coordinate well with other people. So he talked a lot about democracy, but talking about democracy and practicing it consistently, hold on, I have to put in my charger because I just found out my battery is running low, so I fixed it. But practicing it at the same time consistently, it's not always the same thing. But that is, not entirely uncommon. I think in the past we have talked about Rosa Luxemburg, who definitely has always been a champion of, democracy from below. And yet even Rosa Luxemburg has been accused of having operated in a fairly authoritarian fashion together with Leo Jogiches in the Socialist Party of Poland and Lithuania. And Erich Fromm, who also has been a champion of democracy from below. Some people have said in his personal dealings, he could at times be somewhat authoritarian. So when it comes to Wolfgang Harich, he had some interpersonal authoritarian tendencies. Be it as it may, these tendencies became a little more problematic because his project of a German path to socialism, there were other people involved, including the chief editor of this publishing house, the Aufbau Verlag, a guy named Walter Janka. And Harich did not coordinate with his fellow conspirators, so to say. He essentially got it into his mind that he wanted to overthrow Walter Ulbricht. And he made contact with the Soviet ambassador in East Berlin and told him what he wanted to do. And the Soviet ambassador was lukewarm and essentially thought the Harich's plans were half-baked. And Harich essentially more or less walked into Walter Ulbricht's office and told him, I'm going to overthrow you. We're going to get rid of you.
Of course
so he was not the most practical person. He was an interesting guy. He was, brilliant with some of his ideas. And at the same time, he was a little weltfremd at times, right?
I don't know.
It was not, not the greatest idea to tell Ulbricht ahead of schedule.
But that's how you do it,
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
how you do it. That you take your glove and throw it in someone's face, and then you pull out your sword, and then let's go. I mean,
absolutely, absolutely. So lo and behold, eventually Wolfgang Harich got arrested, and Walter Ulbricht was no fan of being overthrown. And many of the people around Wolfgang Harich, while they agreed with Wolfgang Harich's overall idea of democratizing East Germany, they very strongly disagreed with his unwise ways of pursuing these ideas. And then they were also disappointed that Harich confessed everything. And to make a long story short, Harich got a fairly lengthy prison sentence and lost, obviously, his position, his influence, and so on and so forth. But eventually he got released from prison in the 1960s. And his next big project was Eco-Socialism. So he wrote a book called Kommunismus ohne Wachstum, Communism Without Growth. And that book essentially takes place within the context of the development of the Club of Rome, which was an organization of environmentalists who became interested in the concept of zero growth. They essentially realized that the fundamental dilemma of our capitalist system is that capitalism is based on the assumption that the economy must grow. Without economic growth, capitalism enters into a state of crisis. Unemployment will explode. The political system will be under more and more pressure. The social system will be under more and more pressure. And the democratic veneer will start to come off. So economic growth is what makes the capitalist system operate smoothly. If economic growth slows down, or if it disappears altogether, capitalism enters into a situation where it becomes difficult to sustain, and it opens the gateways to fascism as well, But the big problem is we live on a planet with finite resources. So we have a fundamental contradiction, an economic system that can only function if there is essentially unlimited economic growth. And all of this on a planet with finite resources that make unlimited, eternal economic growth impossible. So the Club of Rome advocated that we have to rethink all of this. And they advocated for a new economic model that would, be based on not growing the economy any longer. And this was quite a shock, not only to the usual suspects who defended capitalism as the best system ever, but also to many Marxists, because their assumption had also been that there will be and has to be economic growth. Socialism, they believed, is based on the idea that the forces of production have to be developed more and more. And in fact, socialism will prove its superiority over capitalism by eventually becoming more productive than capitalism, and thus creating the material abundance that will make communism possible. Because communism is, not what exists currently in North Korea or in East Germany in the 1960s and 70s, but what would exist in some future society where, everyone would get their needs met, including their material needs, where people would contribute what they can, and where they would get the compensation they require according to their needs. So there was an East German economist I've already mentioned, Jürgen Kuczynski, who wrote a polemic in the 1970s against the Club of Rome, where he essentially argued these zero growth concepts. They are a ruse on part of capitalism. They are a capitalist idea to discredit socialism. And he said those people who support the degrowth movement, which was in its infancy at that point, they have somewhat of a legitimate argument, in as much as capitalism is irreconcilable with environmental sustainability, because capitalism, Kuczynski acknowledged, is centered around profit maximization and endless capital accumulation. And obviously that is fundamentally at odds with living on a planet with limited resources, with finite resources. But his argument was the situation is fundamentally different in the Soviet realm, in the Eastern Bloc. Kuczynski argued that in the Eastern Bloc, we already have socialism, which means the fundamental contradiction of capitalism has been overcome. So the contradiction between the economic system and nature does not exist any longer. So you can have economic growth without destroying nature within the context of socialism. The next argument Kuczynski made was a little more legitimate. He essentially said those who advocate for zero growth trivialize that much of the world still lives in dire poverty. Much of the global south still lives in dire poverty. And thus, there would have to be a differentiated approach in terms of what societies would indeed need to move to a zero growth economy, and what societies still need to be allowed to grow their economy in order to lift their people out of extreme poverty. And he argued there's a difference fundamentally between growing an economy in order to fulfill legitimate needs, social needs, cultural needs, and fulfilling illegitimate needs such as luxury consumption for a tiny minority of super wealthy people. And Wolfgang Harich absolutely hated this book by Kuczynski. So he wrote Communism Without Growth, essentially, also as a response to Jürgen Kuczynski's polemic against the no growth ideas of the Club of Rome. So Wolfgang Harich advocates in Communism Without Growth for a fundamental reorientation. He essentially argues that the problem with the Eastern Bloc is that it has replicated capitalist models of economic development. It has denied that by using a different rhetoric, calling essentially, what is happening there socialism, but it doesn't obliterate the reality of the situation, which is that whatever is happening in the West is happening in the East as well. Nature is being systematically destroyed. Pollutants are being put into the air, they're being put into the soil, they're being put into the water, and critical thresholds are being ignored, and sooner or later the entire system is going to collapse. And this is not something that can be fixed. Piecemeal, reforms will not do anything. It's a problem of a systemic nature. Mm-hmm. We have to reorient ourselves. Mm-hmm. Growth itself is the issue. And thus, a real socialist and communist society has to be a society that defines human needs differently. Human needs cannot be defined in terms of the accumulation of material goods. It should be defined in terms of living in harmony with nature, and that means accepting even, if necessary, levels of deprivation, because material deprivation, because that is what it takes in order to survive. Wow. And the state, and that's why some have accused him of environmental Stalinism, because he said, and that has to be pursued no matter what, even if a majority of the people don't accept this. The survival of the species means a strong state needs to push this through, whether individual humans accept this or not. Universal reason overrides individual judgment. Using Hegels definition, Freiheit ist Einsicht in die Notwendigkeit. Freedom, real freedom, is acceptance in the logic and inevitability of things.
There's interesting how you explained all that and put the degrowth into context, but I see another problem popping up immediately, and I see PR active, exploitation being sold as growth, and now we are talking about growth as being the problem, while in essence the actual problem never was growing stuff or growing economies or growing whatever, but it's exploitation, actually. And you can grow stuff, you can produce products, which is why it's good we talked about the Eastern Republic of Germany, because their products are still working. It's amazing the kind of stuff they produced. I mean, they didn't have this profit incentive, no planned obsolescence. the stuff actually falls apart now because it's so fucking old. But it kept working and kept working, and you don't have to buy it again and buy another, and you don't have piles of garbage. So there's something going on here that is usually being pushed right off the table by just framing stuff this way. And then we interestingly, talk about growth and take those basic normative statements, essentially, and then work with them on a level of ideology. And it's just basic assumption is kind of wrong. We need to look at that more closely.
Absolutely. Yes, I'm glad you brought up this notion of planned obsolescence, which is so real. I mean, there are always these mythologies, right? East Germany had its mythologies. The West has its mythologies. Capitalism has its mythologies. And one of the mythologies of capitalism is that it is rational. Numbers don't lie.
Mm-hmm.
In my experience, capitalism is one of the most irrational systems you can, and one of the most wasteful systems, right?
Sure.
One of the most bureaucratic systems. It's full of deceit and self-deceit. Yes, the amount of waste of resources is just mind-boggling, and one obviously should not, idealize East Germany or scarcity, but there's something to be said for fixing things when they break, as opposed to constantly throwing things out and buying the latest things, even when they're not broken, or designing things so they will fall apart, as opposed to designing things for durability. Absolutely. And yes, I remember, and I often ask myself, is this just my nostalgia? But things seem to have lasted longer in East Germany than they're lasting now, right?
Now you know why.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I remember spending. I've been teaching in different parts of the world, and yes, in some countries, things. They last longer, and if they break down, then you have to fix them, and that is definitely a more rational use of resources.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So there's a lot more that can be done in terms of also sharing resources and also re-evaluating what you mean with riches, what you mean with wealth. Does wealth mean, owning 5 cars, or owning 3 cars, or owning a lot of consumer products? And what about having more time, for example? Time with your friends, time for reading, time for the development of your interests, and so on and so forth. So redefining what constitutes a good life, what constitutes a rich life, and how that should not just be defined in terms of the accumulation, the endless accumulation of material possessions. So, but let me briefly say one more thing about Wolfgang Harich. He, after he became interested in eco-socialism, and he maintained that interest until the end of his life, the third major project in his life was Friedrich Nietzsche, whom he came to hate with a passion. So Friedrich Nietzsche, essentially, Harich concluded, and he was a very subtle thinker. Harich was an incredibly erudite person. So I don't want anyone to get the idea that Harich was, a crude Stalinist in his philosophical thinking. But when it came to Nietzsche, Harich's attitude was, Nietzsche is a fascist, and no one should read Nietzsche. Nietzsche should be prohibited. And he concluded this, essentially advocating for the censorship of Nietzsche at the time when East Germany began to open up a little bit in the 1980s. When, I mean, in the 1950s and 60s, East Germany essentially followed sort of Georg Lukács's outlook in The Destruction of Reason, that sort of saw Nietzsche as one of the major intellectual path providers of Nazism. And Nietzsche was not readily available in East German bookstores or libraries. But by the 1980s, things changed. East Germany had a more nuanced cultural outlook and policy. So the works of Nietzsche became more available. And at that point, Wolfgang Harich lobbied people, cultural functionaries, scholars, etc., essentially telling them, get rid of Nietzsche, outlaw Nietzsche. Nothing ever written by Nietzsche should be read by anyone. Nietzsche is poison. And he developed a hatred for anyone who had anything by Nietzsche in their bookshelves. So he went on a crusade against Nietzsche and those who had any tolerance for Nietzsche. So he
You
was
know
a person of very...
what that reminds me of? Boomers blaming Antifa now. It's kind of funny.
Yes,
You know,
yeah. So he
the
became...
right-wing mob and their psychological structure is kind of interesting. And it seems to be the same kind of stupidity when you just
Yes.
cherry pick
Yeah.
and then you have so many enemies. Why only them? But yeah, okay, you need one to just hide away your stupid politics, your own lack, essentially. And it's also very Jungian that you attack something that would act like your shadow, something you hate to see in yourself, something you then attack in others, something that is still working in you. It's something, a point of critique you haven't really worked through or whatever. And so you cannot have this honest interaction with the critique being posed. So you have to do this intellectually dishonest bullshit and just go for the character. Try to assassinate
Absolutely.
people directly. And that's something that's very human. I've seen very often, and it doesn't even matter if it's about Nietzsche or Antifa. It seems to be the same thing from Marx. So it's kind of funny.
Absolutely.
So,
but Harich was interesting. He died in 1995. He was an interesting and polarizing figure. Fromm mentioned him within the context of to have or to be. He said, you know, he's one of the few from behind the Iron Curtain who actually really challenges this concept of developing the forces of production, which many, you know, Eastern European Marxist-Leninists take as a core aspect of Marxism. We have to develop the forces of production in order to move into,
it's the enemy
into
who
a
tries
communist
to
society.
Yeah, the enemy who tries to undermine the state by bringing the GDP number down. You could
Yes,
essentially already visualize Trump's stupid PR department telling people the same shit within the next year because the tariffs ruined everything. And now you need to, I don't know.
Exactly. So Wolfgang Harich, and he definitely, you know, was, I mean, he did influence eco-socialist ideas, even if, you know, you did not share any of, or all of his ideas. Communism Without Growth was a book that would, you know, motivate those who thought about Marxism and ecology to continue to think along those lines. It was one of the first major efforts anywhere, and especially in East Germany, on part of an East German Marxist to think in eco-socialist categories. So he was one major thinker, very idiosyncratic thinker, a very interesting personality. People like his chief biographer, Siegfried Prokop, commented on his character. On the one hand, he was supremely self-confident, to the point of being, narcissistic and arrogant, and again, very sure of himself and his intellectual capabilities. And he was incredibly erudite. On the other hand, he also was willing to, yield to an authority if he regarded that authority as legitimate. So when he was arrested by Ulbricht, then he suddenly confessed everything to Ulbricht and accepted his prison sentence. So he was a very strange and peculiar person.
Yeah, don't do
at
that.
the same time, after German unification, the West, the United German State tried to use Harich against the old Stasi people, and and Harich refused to collaborate with them because he said, I will not kick those who are already down. So Harich could be fiercely independent, and at the same time, he could be servile at times. So he was deeply contradictory. And a divisive figure, but also a pioneer in terms of his eco-socialist ideas. Robert Havemann, another very interesting person, probably East Germany's most famous Marxist dissident. If anyone has heard of any Marxist dissidents in East Germany, other than Ernst Bloch, who left, Robert Havemann would probably come to mind. He also ended up being commemorated in Yad Vashem in Israel as one of the righteous Gentiles, because he did save Jewish people in Nazi Germany. And as I've mentioned before, he himself actually ended up being put to death by the Nazis. He was sentenced to death. And it's interesting how he survived, because most people that were sentenced to death by the Nazis actually were executed. So any idea how he survived? It's a deeply bizarre story.
Stop with the weird questions, man. How would I?
Yeah. So how he survived? I mean, it's so counterintuitive. I mean, I ask myself, how is that even possible? So what happened was essentially the Nazis sentenced him to death, but Havermann's friends and colleagues, because he was a chemist, they said his research might help us win the war. So why don't we postpone his execution so he can do kriegswichtige Forschung, he can continue his research, which will help us win the war. Mm-hmm. And once we have won the war, then we can execute him.
Oh, so, sweet. Have been useful
they put him
for a while.
into the prison in Brandenburg, where he was incidentally in the same prison as Erich Honecker, later on the leader of East Germany. So he is in prison, but he has his own laboratory in prison. And he does research for the Nazis. And I don't know why the Nazis would expect him to, do very efficient research, because I don't know, if I were Havemann, I would not want the Nazis to win the war, because when the Nazis win the war, that would have meant his execution. Mm-hmm. If I were Havemann, I would want the Nazis to lose the war, so I would not get executed. So, but so he's imprisoned. So he gets imprisoned because he's part of several anti-Nazi resistance groups. And so he joins the Communist Party in 1930, and the explanation he gives for that, because like Harich, he comes from the educated middle class. He joins the Nazis because the Communist Party because he thinks the communists are the most consistent anti-Nazi resistance fighters. At that point, the Communist Party in Germany is already fully Stalinized. The Communist Party used to be the party led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. And for the first few years after their murder, the party is still an independent communist party, the largest communist party outside of the Soviet Union. But with the rise of Ernst Thälmann to the party leadership, the Communist Party in Germany will be turned into a Stalinist cadre party. And by 1930, the party is definitely a Stalinized party. But Havemann is also, like Harich, a very contradictory person. So he accepts the Stalinist party line on many issues. And later on, he will even write a book called Yes, I Was a Stalinist. So he will see himself in hindsight as a Stalinist. But at the same time, even at his heyday as a Stalinist in the 1930s, he will be involved with resistance groups like the European Union. It was a small resistance group. It has nothing to do with the European Union of today, of course. And that resistance group tried to bring together communists and social democrats. And that is a wonderful thing, and also very much something in opposition to the Stalinist party line, because the Stalinist party line at that time period promoted the idea of the social democrats being social fascists, being worse than the Nazis and the main enemy. The Social Democratic Party leadership had similarly crazy ideas. They essentially looked at the communists as mortal enemies as well. So both the Communist Party leadership and the Social Democratic Party leadership, they were unwilling to collaborate in order to fight the Nazis. But the small resistance group did. They thought, you know, Nazism is the main threat right now. Whatever disagreements we have as communists and social democrats, they're not as important than what we need to oppose together, the fascist threat. So they worked together, and Havemann was part of that. But eventually, Havemann gets caught. The Nazis imprison him, sentence him to death, and he survives. And after the war, is a professor again, is briefly the director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft, the predecessor of the Max Planck Institute. And because of the Cold War and his communist convictions, has to eventually relocate from West Berlin to East Berlin and becomes a professor of chemistry at Humboldt University, the dean of student affairs, and a member of the East German parliament. So a fairly significant career in East Germany. And he is well-adjusted, powerful and important figure in East German society. And East Germany needs him because he has a bona fide career as an anti-fascist, someone who was in prison, someone who was sentenced to death, famous and internationally respected chemist. And then 1956 comes along, de-Stalinization, which makes Robert Havemann begin to think more critically about what it means to be a communist, and that maybe the party line is not always the right way to think about things. So he will give a series of lectures at Humboldt University where he will ask himself and his students, has philosophy, Marxist philosophy, always helped natural scientists like physicists and chemists in solving their problems? And to him, Marxist philosophy means largely Marxist-Leninist philosophy, which in reality has meant Stalinist philosophy? And his answer will be, not really. There has been a lot of dogmatism. And this lecture series is incredibly popular. Hundreds of students, most of them not even philosophy students, want to listen to these lectures. And Havemann will eventually publish them in the West, because he cannot publish them in the East, in a book called Dialektik ohne Dogma, Dialectic Without Dogma. And this book will be the last straw that will get him dismissed from his university position, and he will also be expelled from the party. And the reason for that break, where Havemann is transformed from being a darling of the party who shower him with praise and support and positions of power and prestige, to losing everything, will be publishing in the West. They're essentially saying, you can be critical in the East, you can be critical, but ultimately we decide how much you can say. And the one line you cannot cross is publishing in the West. When we tell you you cannot publish this, that must be the end of it. But if you try to circumvent that by publishing in the West, then you have crossed a line from being a critic, but still loyal to our system, to becoming our enemy and helping our enemy. So when he is dismissed from all of his positions, the party leadership has to figure out what to do with him, and they decide they want to get rid of him. They want him to leave. Hence, they make conditions so difficult, because when they fire him, they know he has no income, but he still has some savings. So he's not leaving. So can they imprison him? And we already said they cannot, because he was imprisoned by the Nazis and even sentenced to death. So they put him under house arrest, which means now there will be over 70 plainclothes police officers who will be around his summer estate, his dacha, on the outskirts of Berlin on some lake, and he will be there. And he essentially cannot leave except for one weekly trip to the grocery store, which he has to do under police escort as well. And while he is under house arrest and probably quite bored, he becomes interested in ecological issues. And he writes a book called Morgen, Industriegesellschaft im Aufbruch, Morning, an industrial society, looking for new frontiers. That's my ad hoc English translation. The book will come out in West Germany. It will not be translated into English, but it will be essentially his attempt at developing an eco-socialist version of Marxism. And he will essentially do what Wolfgang Harich did as well. He will look at the realities in East Germany, and what will he see in East Germany? He will see that East Germany has replicated the problems of Western capitalist societies. East Germany, in fact, in some ways, has an even more questionable environmental record than West Germany, because of a variety of reasons. There is, of course, the problem that East Germany very much depends on the Soviet Union for its natural resources, especially its oil. East Germany does not have any oil on its own, and it used to get oil from the Soviet Union at subsidized prices. The Soviet Union cannot afford that any longer, so East Germany cannot afford to get the oil it needs. So it has to make painful decisions about how to deal with its energy requirements, so it will have to switch to coal. but coal is much more pollutant than the oil it used to get from the Soviet Union. So East Germany, by using brown coal, its brown coal deposits will become a much more polluted place. And East Germany is also technologically more antiquated compared to the West because there is a technological barrier. The West essentially is not allowing the free flow of technology to the Eastern Bloc. They want to harm the Eastern Bloc, obviously. So there are all sorts of reasons why the environmental situation is deteriorating in East Germany. And Robert Havemann is trying to understand all of this, and this eco-socialist critique is essentially a critique of the entire planning system, the entire economic system that was developed within the context of the Stalinist or neo-Stalinist system that came into existence in the 1970s and 80s within the Soviet bloc. So Havermann's book could not be published in East Germany, but it's published in the West. And what the West gets out of it, by and large, is Marxism is, at least the East German official version, is ecologically not sustainable. So Robert Havemann sees himself as a Marxist, but the way the book is promoted in the West German mainstream is it is being promoted as a repudiation of the entire socialist project as ecologically antiquated. But that is not what Havemann wants to do. Havemann argues that both Western capitalism and Soviet-style Eastern and Central European, if you look at East Germany and Czechoslovakia and Poland, the Central European, those types of socialism are ecologically antiquated. But we need a socialist alternative, but it has to be an eco-socialist alternative. Now, I've spoken for quite a while. I'm sure you probably have some comments or questions, so I want to turn it over to you again for that.
Actually, no. It's just deep up there this time. Very good. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I learned a lot today. And or maybe one thing, I don't know why, but I thought about the French resistance. So they've been highly successful. And there are, by now, I think, scientists who looked back at that and said, wait a second, if they went on like that for a few more years, they might actually be able to bring the Nazis down just by sheer massive disaster in logistics. Pretty much all they did, just blowing up train tracks, but lots of train tracks. And at some point, yeah, you bring a system to a halt this way too. So that's something to pick up on. It's kind of Rosa Luxemburg's general strike on another level as a saboteur. But hey, why not? Interesting thought. I found that kind of convincing. And I didn't know that either. I always thought that resistance was kind of ineffective as it was in Germany against the Nazis, because the Nazis already got rid of all the people who would have been in the resistance later, before, by cleaning up and bringing them into the... So, yeah. But besides from that, just some random thoughts. I don't know. We said we didn't want to go on that long today. Do we want to add some final remarks? I don't know. Otherwise, we could just end it here.
Yeah, I always have final remarks to add, and then maybe continue it in some fashion, because I still have, I still want to flesh out Rudolf Bahro, the third of our three eco-socialists, a little bit. But in terms of kind of final remarks, summarizing and concluding things, Robert Havemann, but also Wolfgang Harich, they look at philosophical reflections on eco-socialism and Marxism in general as part of a philosophy of praxis. So the idea here is that ideas should not just be confined to the theoretical realm. They should be motivations for praxis, for acting in the world. And that is very important to Bahro as well, right? Thinking about ecological questions means thinking about how to transform our economic and social systems. In practical terms as well, what do we need to do? Because first of all, time is running out, right? We do not have centuries. We do not have an endless amount of decades either. There have been so many United Nations climate reports. And if I remember the last ones properly, I think they gave us time frame of about 10 to 15 years. If nothing drastic changes, then the climate change we're looking at will go from really bad to absolutely catastrophic, right? So what should we do? And one big problem is paralysis, right? When we hear all the bad news, so many of us are tempted for good reason to say, we're all lost, we're doomed, right? What can we do? There's nothing that can be done, right? It's too late. It's already too late. And I think that is the most dangerous conclusion we can reach, because if we say we're already lost, then we are for sure already lost, right? So, and I think Wolfgang Harich, Robert Havemann, and Rudolf Bahro, whether they are right about every detail or not, what strikes me in their books is a sense of optimism in terms of doing something, right? Their books were meant to mobilize people. And that is what we need today more than ever. We need to mobilize people. The situation is dire. It's very dire, but we need to use that as a way to say to ourselves, that should not paralyze us, that should force us and compel us to do something. Our house is on fire, but that should not mean we should just resign ourselves to our fate. We have an obligation to try to save ourselves and to save others, and things can still be done. Most people now, if they have half a brain, realize climate change, human-induced, human-driven climate change is very real. And we also know what is behind it, the capitalist system. Piecemeal reforms will not do it. We need massive transformation, and we need to be active and do things right now. And what we need to do has to be quite drastic. There have been lots of different books. One title, To Blow Up a Pipeline, is not a call for eco-terrorism. It's a call to, wake us up to the seriousness of this situation, right? The system has to be transformed. The data is very clear, and we have to act. So, and again, to me, what matters is to be mindful of the scale of the problem, and to not use our awareness of that scale to wallow in defeatism and catastrophism, as in, saying we're lost anyhow, or to just be scared senseless, but to be motivated along the lines of, as Gramsci put it, pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will.
There we go again. We've heard that a few times on this show. You will hear
Absolutely.
that again a few times in the future. I hope so.
Absolutely.
It's one of our red threads in this red show. Yeah, thank you very much. I think that was it. You're short on time. No meeting for anybody afterwards. So we see us again in, I don't know, 1-2 weeks or so.
That sounds good. And then I will wrap it up and say a few more things about Rudolf Bahro, and then maybe talk about contemporary eco-socialists and degrowth ideas, and talk about John Bellamy Foster and some more contemporary thinkers.
All right. All right. Already looking forward to that. Then I'm going to hit the button. Bye,
Sounds
people.
great.